Hello and welcome to interest.co.nz. I'm Gareth Vaughan. I'm joined by political commentator Chris Trotter to discuss the political landscape as 2022 nears its end and we head into the 2023 election year. Hi, Chris, and welcome. Good to see you.
Look, thank you very much for having me on, Gareth.
Yeah, look, 2022 is obviously almost over. Really interested to get your assessment of the political landscape and the general mood of the electorate as we head into an election year. So
everybody's pretty clear, I think, about the major influences going into 2023. They focus with laser-like intensity, if all of the commentators out there, particularly the economists, are to be believed, on the cost of living and all of the issues related to it. For example, in fighting inflation, the Reserve Bank is steadily raising the official cash rate, which is driving up people's mortgages, and that is going to hit hardest, we are given to understand, early in the new year. That will have a very serious impact because that goes to what people call the wealth effect. In the halcyon days, when the houses just kept going up and up and up and up in terms of their ostensible value, and interest rates were near zero, everything was fine. People felt extremely wealthy. They read the supposed value of their property and beamed from ear to ear. But when suddenly everything turns topsy-turvy and the value of the property is steadily declining and the cost of your mortgage is steadily rising, this is not a recipe for a happy population, or at least a happy population of mortgage holders. So that's going to affect people very seriously, those particularly who have just taken on mortgages rather than have been paying them off for 20 years. But related to that, of course, is the cost of food, is the price of power, the price of petrol at the pump. All of these things flow into how people feel about life in general, and how they feel about the government in particular. And the accepted wisdom is that they will not be feeling very happy with the government. They will be thinking that the government has ballsed it up somehow. And with an election looming, that leads people to cogitate upon the possibility of maybe changing their vote this time around. And a lot of people will be in that position because an awful lot of people who didn't used to vote Labour as a rule voted Labour last time. Hundreds of thousands of people who didn't usually vote for the Labour Party voted Labour last time. And those fair weather friends, looking up and seeing nothing but rain clouds and feeling decidedly damp, are unlikely to stay with Labour. So that tends to explain Labour's steady decline in the polls, and it will almost certainly explain a change of government, which most people are anticipating in 2023.
It's been quite a turnaround since 2020. I mean, if you think back, Labour won a majority, for a single party winning a majority for the first time under MMP, which even John Key, at the height of his popularity, he didn't manage that. It seems a long time ago now, though, 2020, doesn't it? So if we run through the parties and look at their prospects heading into 2023, we'll start with Labour as the incumbent government. I mean, you've outlined the key problem that they face is the cost of living issues and the fact that people will always blame a government when things like this are happening. Whether it's fair or unfair is debatable, but they will blame the government. So what are Labour's prospects, and what do they need to do perhaps to stay in power?
Well, there is a way back for the Labour Party, but it's a very very rocky road that they're going to have to traverse before they reach the broad sunlit uplands, as Boris Johnson was fond of quoting Winston Churchill about. First of all, they're going to have to recover the trust of the New Zealand people, and that has been lost amongst quite a large number of New Zealanders, quite a large chunk or chunks of the electorate. Perhaps the most dramatic loss of trust came from the people who are on the receiving end of vaccination mandates. They were, of course, promised that these would not be imposed, and when they were, the reaction was vociferous, to say the least. Indeed, I've very rarely encountered animosity on the scale generated among those who opposed vaccination for COVID-19, and most particularly the vaccination mandates, the no jab, no job edicts from the government. So there were those, and we saw them gather on the lawn in front of Parliament in February and March, and that didn't end well. We've seen it on and off across the country, most recently in the strange case of baby Will. But that's out there, and I don't think it's stretching a point to say hatred generated and directed towards the Prime Minister is really quite disturbing. Beyond that group, however, we have the people who really are very suspicious of projects like Three Waters, the merger of Radio New Zealand and Television New Zealand, the whole United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the report prepared more or less in secret, called He Pua. These are mostly, I think, Pākehā New Zealanders, mostly male, mostly over the age of 50, 55. But that's a lot of people. Thanks to the baby boom generation, that's still a lot of people. And they may have been, although not that many of them, one suspects, but some of them will have voted Labour in 2020 on the basis of Jacinda Ardern's handling of the first 9 or 10 months of the pandemic, which was spectacular, absolutely spectacular. So there's those, and then of course there's the rest, and the rest need to see from the government some indication that it knows how seriously it has offended a very large number of New Zealanders, and how very, very badly it has failed to deliver on a number of key promises, particularly in relation to housing. If Labour could somehow reset itself, admit to its failures, offer a plausible explanation for them, and then say, having learned from these things, having, in a sense, spent 5 years working out just how difficult it is to keep big promises, we're going to scale them down to a point where we are pretty confident we can keep them. And first and foremost among those promises will be that we are going to tackle the cost of living, we are going to manage the economy in a sensible way. And one of the ways they could gain credence for such a bid for the forgiveness of the electorate is to highlight just how much better New Zealand is doing than most of the countries with which it usually likes to compare itself, because we are doing extraordinarily well. The economy is doing better than expected. Employment has remained astonishingly high. There are a whole series of indicators. Even in relation to COVID, we are still well below the experience of countries like our own. So there is a way but it's a very difficult way for politicians to take, because politicians do not like to admit to their faults, do not like to own their errors. And it would take someone of Jacinda Ardern's talent, and she has enormous talent when it comes to communications. And she is nowhere more effective at communicating with New Zealanders than when she throws the rule book away, or when the rule book is thrown away or ceases to be relevant, as when an Australian guns down 51 people in 2 mosques in Christchurch, or a volcano erupts, or a global pandemic sweeps across her country. She's really good when she's improvising, when she's responding to events from the heart rather than the head. But whether she can do that in the plain old vanilla governing the country, managing the economy, delivering on your promises. I mean, the biggest surprise for me about Jacinda Ardern's ministry is that for someone who worked so closely with Helen Clark for so many years, she never seemed to get the one great insight of Helen Clark as a Labour leader, which was under promise and over. She did the opposite. She wildly overpromised and then lamentably underdelivered. So she needs to turn that around. So that's Labour's path back. Chances of them doing it, very, very small, I would say.
Okay, so on to the National Party. So obviously current polling suggests that they will be forming a government later next year. So what do they need to do between now and then?
Pretty much what they're doing. I would say to Christopher Luxon, though, bury your head in some political and history books, particularly recent political history, so that you get a much more instinctive feel for what the country is going to take a sharp breath at or grin broadly at, because you really don't seem to work that out just yet. Maybe it's the years that he spent offshore, I don't know, although that never seemed to cramp John Key's style. But essentially what National is doing is saying, hey, everybody, look over here, we're not Labour. And we've got this new leader, and he's a pretty personable sort of chap. And with the National Party, we know how to run an economy, not like these clowns. So you know what to do, you know which button to push. So come election, we're trusting you to do the right thing. That's pretty much National's campaign strategy, and it's almost certainly the right one. I mean, it's always tempting, particularly if you're an ideologically driven politician, to get out the flag and run it up the flagpole and say, here it is, this is what we believe in, these are the things we're going to do, like David Seymour. But you're not really good for much above 10% by going that way. Now, I speak from bitter experience, because I was once, for my sins, a member of the New Labour Party under Jim Anderton, and that's exactly what we did. And we got about 5% of the vote. It's nice, but it don't bring you the treasury benches. And National strategy of keeping itself the smallest possible target is the right one. They will be elected because they are not Labour, and provided Labour doesn't give them a really spectacular reason for reconsidering them, people are likely to think, who's got the best chance of replacing these people? National, Luxon. Bit dull, bit bland, but hell, bland is good. I'll take bland. That seems to be the way they're looking at next year. When they get into power, people might get a surprise because conventional wisdom would suggest that things are going to be rocky and hard decisions are going to have to be made. But they'll make them because they're gnats. That's what gnats do.
So on to the smaller parties. I mean, you mentioned ACT there. How do you see things shaping up for them at this point?
I think they're just going to cruise along pretty much around the numbers poll-wise that they've been displaying all year. They seem to be good for around 10% of the vote. That would be a really excellent result for them. 6-7% would be quite so good. But I think they'll hold that because unless Labor sort of puts on that hair shirt I described earlier, and particularly unless Labor ditches, really hot button issues like co-governance and hate speech, which have served ACT extremely well, it has to be said, ever since Labor raised them. Unless Labor does that, then the anger and the frustration of people who really don't like those ideas will be there for ACT rather than National, because National, to hold that big vote to become the government as opposed to a small and feisty opposition party, it can't make hay out of that particular field of grass. So it's
okay.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
Okay, so next, what about the Greens? How are their prospects shaping up?
Oh, the Greens could be doing way, way better than they are, because when Labor disappoints, that's usually the centre left and further to the left queue for shifting their vote, either in desperation or in protest, to the Greens. But the Greens have been caught up in the coils of identity politics now for several years, and they have lost focus, it seems to me, on the big issues, which of course include climate change, the biggest issue of all. They're also, they're caught up in this terrible dilemma of the modern left, which sees so many who think of themselves as progressive adopting very odd stances compared to where left-wingers were positioned, say, 30 or 40 years ago. So you get the Greens promoting very strongly the essential differences between human beings, whereas once the left used to promote the essential similarities of human beings. I mean, Martin Luther King's famous dream that his little would live in a land where they are judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. That used to be, the left was, well, Martin Luther King wouldn't get away with that today, you see. And the Greens are caught up in this problem for the left, which I think is seriously limiting where they could go. In many ways, I mean, there were issues that Labor raised which the Greens could have grabbed with as much success as ACT if they had been the Greens of yesteryear, the Greens of Jeanette Fitzsimons and Rod Donald and Sue Bradford and Keith Locke. But those sort of get there between 5 and 10%. I'm pretty confident of that. But I think they could have been good for 15 or more had they positioned themselves in a less ideologically discordant fashion. And so they probably will do as well as ACT, but only, I suspect, because Labour will do so badly. And they certainly won't have the numbers, because Labour won't have the numbers to get 61 seats in the House of Representatives. So yeah, missed opportunities all around for the Greens, I think, although they have had enough sense over the last few months, particularly since the debacle over James Shaw's failure to be re-elected, albeit with 75% or whatever it was of the vote. They have learned to shut up, which was a very, very good strategy, in my opinion, because since they have shut up, that their numbers have held, and that's a good thing, because really, if every time you open your mouth, you only make things worse, then staying silent is very much the best policy.
Of course, there's one more party that's currently in Parliament, the Māori Party. So just interested to get your thoughts on where they're at. And also, what about some of the parties outside Parliament that might have a chance of getting in? I mean, obviously, Winston Peters, New Zealand First, is still out there. He's getting very vocal. Someone like the Opportunities Party or TOP, polling around, I think, 3%-ish, 2-3%-ish mostly. And perhaps any others that you think might have a chance of getting in?
Well, I think the Māori Party is likely to benefit from the decline in Labour's numbers and the loss of Labour's Māori working class support, which they courted quite consciously and assiduously in both 2017 and 2020, particularly in 2017. Gosh, if you saw the ads that went out in the Māori electorates in 2017, an old codger and an old Labour man like me looked at those and thought, my God, they are just like the ads Labour used to run in the days before it embraced Rogernomics. I mean, it was the most working class pitch you ever saw. And it worked. It worked brilliantly, because the majority of Māori are working class New Zealanders, and it worked a treat. But with the cost of living grinding them down, and rents grinding them down, and all of the other pressures upon working class families in New Zealand, Labour's numbers are likely to be depressed in the Māori seats, and that can only be to the advantage of the Māori Party. So I'd say they'd come back in with more MPs than they have now. Whether they'll crest that 5% threshold, whether they'll get 6 or 7, we'll have to see. It rather depends on just how badly Labour does. Although if Labour kind of resets itself and throws aside some of those really controversial policies like co-governance, then the rebound in the Māori seats will be fairly staunch, I would think. So, it's an ill wind and all that. Winston, I think, will depend upon voters in the South Island. And I think his tried and election after election is he tours small towns and small communities across rural and provincial New Zealand, and it works. It always works. Well, nearly always works. And so I'd say he's probably good for 5%. He'll be competing with ACT for those grumpy older white males, but we'll see how much of ACT's vote he's able to scrape off. He's an older man than he was last time, obviously, but he still seems keen, and you can never, ever get rich betting against Winston Peters.
Absolutely.
At the top, well, this complicated routine they're going down in Christchurch, whereby Ralph Mungie will stand in Ilam, and if he looks like he has a chance there, well, then TOP's vote may improve, because people will say, oh, well, if he gets that seat, our vote isn't wasted. So we shall see. But TOP and New Zealand First, they seem to me the only parties currently outside Parliament that have a chance.
One of the interesting things we've seen in Australia in recent years is the emergence of the so-called teal independent candidates, which have been mostly urban women running on strong climate change agendas, challenging Liberal Party incumbent MPs. And they've obviously had some success doing that. I'm just wondering, do you think any sort of new movement might emerge in New Zealand before the election next year?
Apart from the ones we've seen already, most particularly the far-right ones that sort of spun out of the occupation of Parliament grounds, who strike me as most unlikely to get anywhere near 5% of the vote. I think the teal phenomenon could be repeated in New Zealand, but only in circumstances similar to those that propelled them into the House of Representatives in Australia, namely that the main right-wing parties would have to be perceived as veering off into the long grass in a major way. In other words, embracing far-right ideas that were just well outside the mainstream. They would also, of course, be dependent upon the same sort of character as Simon A. Court, I think it was, the man who pumped millions and millions of dollars. Because what do you need to become a teal independent, in inverted commas, MP? Well, you need what Joe Kennedy told his sons you needed to become President of the United States. You need three things, he said. The first one is money. The second one, money. And the third one, of course, is money. And and the teals in Australia had money to burn almost. And if you've got money to burn and you're standing in seats where there are very wealthy, highly educated people of conservative views who believe their traditional party has gone well and truly off the rails, then if a really spectacular candidate is put in front of you, and they were very good candidates. I mean, you just had to see them. Oh, goodness. Yeah, with a bit of money, I think I could get this person into Parliament. And yeah, that's exactly what happened. They had a bit of money and they went there. But, you know, it's really important to remember that it was in those blue ribbon seats in Melbourne and Sydney where they had the most success. These were the seats occupied traditionally by the Liberal Party grandees, you know, the great and the good of the Liberal Party. They seem to get into those seats, you know, and inherit them along with their squatters' wealth. So, you know, when they saw people they would, I'm sure, regard as right-wing larrikins taking over their party, they were willing to teach.
Chris, you've talked a bit about Jacinda Ardern and Christopher Luxon as our two prime ministerial candidates, if you like. I'm curious as to whether you think Grant Robertson and Nicola Willis will be potentially influential in election year, especially with cost of living issues to the fore, and also potentially or probably a recession next year with them as finance spokespeople. How important are they going to be to their respective parties?
Well, I think Nicola Willis is going to be really important to Christopher Luxon because, quite apart from being a very sharp politician, she's also a great speechwriter. I would be very surprised if Nicola Willis hadn't had a major role to play in the speech that Luxon delivered in response to Volodymyr Zelensky, which was easily the best speech I've seen him deliver. She was a great ally of John Key, and I think she, you know, is really the brains in the National Party at the moment. So she'll play a really important role next year. She's not too bad on finance, although I'm not entirely sure it's her thing to the extent that it's Grant Robertson's thing. And Grant is pretty good. Grant has fought the temptation largely successfully to go all out in the sort of Labour ideological stakes. He's got a social insurance scheme, which I think is a little risky, but that's really the only one. And he's really pushing, the conservative, balanced finance minister image for all it's worth. So the two of them will be important next year. Nicola, more for her strategic and her rhetorical skills. Grant for his 5 years in the office, the experience that he's gained.
So let's just wrap up, Chris, by looking into your crystal ball and at the actual outcome. What do you expect the outcome will be next year in the election? At this stage, looking at the trajectory of the parties in terms of the graphs plotted on any number of I cannot see the government being returned to office. I think it will be a comfortable National Act majority, and that's going to be very interesting, because if ACT is able to hold steady at 10 or more, even if it gets up to 11 or 12%, it's a big enough chunk of the right-wing vote for them to really kick ass in terms of policy. And I'm pretty sure that David Seymour is honing his kicking skills. And I'm not sure that Christopher Luxon has the experience in politics not to be sent careening all over the paddock. So that aftermath of victory could be every bit as interesting as the battle itself. Okay, thanks, Chris. Let's wrap it up there. That's political commentator Chris Trotter, and I'm Gareth Vaughan at interest.co.nz.